So, let's talk about a really powerful and pretty controversial idea that deep down, our modern minds are still running on Stone Age software. Today, we're diving into the big critiques of evolutionary psychology, a field that claims it's found the master key to human nature. And we're going to do it all through the arguments laid out in the book Alas Poor Darwin. And that really gets to the heart of it, right? Are we just puppets with our DNA pulling all the strings? Or is the story of who we are, our thoughts, our cultures, our actions, a whole lot more complicated? That's the huge debate we're going to unpack. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the big promise of this so-called theory of everything. Then we'll ask if it's really based on solid science or just a bunch of speculation. After that, we'll challenge the whole idea of biology versus culture. We'll look at the problems with the concept of cultural memes. And finally, we'll see why this whole debate has some serious, real-world consequences. Okay, first up, let's talk about why evolutionary psychology, or EP, is so appealing in the first place. It makes this almost irresistible promise that there's one single powerful theory that can explain, well, everything, from love and war to art and religion.
So the core idea here is that our modern brains are basically running on ancient programming. Proponents, like the biologist E.O. Wilson, argue that pretty much everything we do, our moral compass, our cultural rules, it's all been shaped by one single thing: natural selection. And the goal? To pass on our genes. I mean, just stop and think about how huge that claim is for a second. We're not just talking about physical stuff like eye color. The argument is that natural selection is the master key that unlocks our most complex social behaviors, our deepest relationships, even our entire cultures. It's really positioned as a theory of everything for humanity. Okay, so the claims are massive. But what about the evidence? Is it actually solid? This brings us to the first major critique from the book: the accusation that some of these theories aren't really grounded in science at all, but in what the authors call speculative fantasies. Well, to really dig into this, the book's authors zero in on one deeply controversial example: the theory of rape put forward by Thornhill and Palmer. This is used as a kind of case study to show what they see as some huge methodological problems in the field. So, here's the argument, plain and simple. The EP claim is that rape is an evolved reproductive strategy for men who can't otherwise find a mate and pass on their genes. But the critique from Alas Poor Darwin is blunt. They argue that this explanation just completely ignores the real-world evidence of who is victimized and why. So the critics basically say, look, this theory just doesn't line up with the real world. For one thing, many victims aren't of fertile age, which right away pokes a hole in the reproductive motive. They also criticize drawing a direct line from animal behavior, like forced mating in scorpion flies, to a complex, violent human act. The theory, they say, seems to skip over much more direct explanations rooted in things like power, violence, and psychology. And this whole thing, it actually opens up a much bigger, more philosophical can of worms. The authors of Alas Poor Darwin start to suggest that the entire biology versus culture, or nature versus nurture debate is, well, a total dead end. So the book really asks us to take a step back and think, is this even the right way to frame the question? I mean, is your life really a battle between these two opposing forces called biology and culture? The authors argue that by trying to cram everything into one box or the other, we're fundamentally misunderstanding what it means to be a person. Think about something as basic as walking, right? It's a great example from anthropologist Tim Ingold. Is walking biological? Well, of course. But is it only biological? Absolutely not. We learn to walk on pavement or grass, in shoes or barefoot, in a very specific cultural context. Biology, culture, and your environment, they aren't separate ingredients you just mix together. They're woven into each other from the very start. This diagram from the book is a really cool way to picture this. Think of it like this. A simple reflex, like a sneeze, that's almost entirely driven by genes. But as you move towards more complex actions, like how you eat or the kind of art you create, you're in a space where genes, culture, and your own individual freedom are all mixing together. It's not a simple on-off switch. It's a whole spectrum of interwoven influences. All right, next up, the critiques takes aim at a really popular idea that spun out of this whole evolutionary way of thinking: memetics. This is the theory that culture evolves just like biology through these little units called memes. So the word meme, and we're not just talking about internet cats here, was actually coined by Richard Dawkins. He described it as a kind of cultural gene. A catchy tune, a fashion trend, a big idea. The theory is that these memes replicate by jumping from brain to brain, competing for survival in the cultural landscape, just like genes do in the biological one. But critics like Stephen Jay Gould come along and say, hold on, this whole analogy is just wrong. Genetic evolution, Darwinian evolution, creates a branching tree of life. It's slow, and species split off and become separate, but culture, it works completely differently. We intentionally pass on what we learn, and ideas can jump from one branch to a totally different one. So culture doesn't look like a tree at all. It's more like a super complex, interconnected web where ideas are constantly merging and combining. Let's break down the key differences, because they're huge. Genetic change moves at a snail's pace, passed down from parent to child. Cultural change can be like a tidal wave. It spreads sideways, horizontally, and it is incredibly fast. And maybe most importantly, our brains are not photocopiers. We don't just perfectly replicate ideas. We actively interpret them, we transform them, we blend them into something totally new. And the philosopher Mary Midgley has this absolutely brilliant way of putting it. She says you can't break down an ocean current into little current particles, because a current isn't a thing, it's a pattern of movement. And culture, she says, is exactly the same. It's a dynamic pattern of human interaction, not a box full of tiny gene-like bits. So, after all this, why does any of it matter? Why should we care about this academic debate? Well, this is where it gets really critical. The authors of Alas Poor Darwin argue that these ideas don't just stay in a university lab. They have profound, real-world social and political consequences. The huge problem they point to is something called the is-ought fallacy. It's a classic error in logic. It's when you make a leap from describing how things supposedly are in nature to saying that's how our society ought to be. So just because someone might argue a behavior is natural or evolved, that absolutely does not automatically make it good or right or something we can't change. And the book lays out some really stark consequences when this kind of thinking gets out into the real world. Theories about genetic destiny have been used to try and justify economic inequality as some kind of genetic justice. They've been used to argue against social programs, claiming some people are just biologically incapable of benefiting. And they can start to erode really fundamental concepts like free will and moral responsibility, which are the bedrock of our legal and social systems. So in the end, the critique in Alas Poor Darwin isn't about throwing biology out the window. Not at all. It's really a call for a more complex, a more nuanced, and a more responsible science. And it leaves us with this final, really powerful question. Science tells stories about who we are. So what is our responsibility for the stories we choose to tell and the ones we choose to believe?